There'll be baby sounds for anybody watching this video, I guarantee it. That's just my baby over there.
So do you want to share your screen or should I?
I don't have anything to share really, but we can
You
talk
linked the
through.
Epic that
There is an Epic, yeah. We could look at that. I can also just talk about kind of the idea and yeah. I'll start with that, and if you want to pull up the Epic, we can then explore that or however we want to do it. But I'll just start by talking about what the overall idea here was. This concept of doing something in this space for the hyperclouds came from the fact that we've got a really, really nice user experience for Kubernetes. If you're using Kubernetes, you can use Auto DevOps, and it will automatically detect what's in your project using Heroku build packs. It will run the build, it will run the tests, it will build a container if you've got a container in there. It will even build other kinds of things. So like if you've got like a Ruby project, there's a Heroku build pack for Ruby, and it will know how, or like if it's Rails, it will know how to build a Rails application automatically. You don't have to write a GitLab CI YAML for it. And then if you integrate a Kubernetes cluster with it, then Auto DevOps also knows how to take that output and deploy it to your cluster that's associated with your project or your group, which is super, super cool. So it doesn't fit every use case, but for a lot of use cases, and especially ones where you're building a container, you can get, you know, a build and deploy to your test environment all up and running super, super easy. And you also get to take advantage then of incremental rollout, canary rollouts, and all these features that we've built. But if you're using ECR or ECS, which is the Amazon container services, where you're deploying a container to virtual hardware, but it's not through Kubernetes, or the same thing in Azure or the same thing in GCP, then we don't really do anything for you. You can still use Auto DevOps to get the build and get a container built. It'll deploy it even to the GitLab container registry if you're using that. Possibly it will even deploy to the container registry of your project, but I'm not, if you're using the Google or Amazon one, but I'm not 100% sure about that. It will at least deploy to ours for sure. But then it leaves you there and you're like, and then you have to figure out how to do the deployment on your own. Doing the deployment on your own is not terribly complicated, and probably the person knows how to do it, but there's some pieces missing there where we can make it really easy. The dream is getting to the point where you can just essentially do the same thing that you do for Kubernetes, where you wouldn't be configuring your cluster and providing us the credentials to it, but you'd be configuring, like, you know, what is the AWS, the ECS environment that you want to deploy to, and what are the credentials for it. We have an issue that's around collecting credentials for Amazon in particular that we can start with. I think it's scheduled for 12.7. I'm not 100% sure on that though. And then using that, we could say, well, we can automatically, if you're providing those credentials to us, and then you're providing us, you know, the target in some way. There's the task definition, which is a JSON file. If we have a task definition file that's checked in, we have credentials that you provided to us. In theory, at that point, we can automatically do everything for you. We can just look at your project and know that it's deploying to ECS, and just automatically do it for you as part of the process, which would be super cool. There are steps that we can do in the meantime, like in 12.6, I think we're delivering the container. So there is no, so right now, if you want to use the AWS command line client, even Amazon doesn't provide a base container that you can use that's like their build/deploy environment for running commands. So we can provide a nice container that's part of the GitLab portfolio of containers that you can use with the build process, and then just use that in the image and then run the AWS commands, the command line client from the script section of your GitLab CI YAML. That's cool. That's a nice step forward. Then we also have that integrated credentials thing, which could make that experience even nicer, because we could make our container then automatically understand and work with those credentials.
Speaking of credentials, do we want them as part of the YAML file, as part of the environment variables? Where do we expect people to configure them? And what kind of permissions do we want this, like, what kind of permissions does the user have to supply? Does it have to,
Yeah.
I assume it's not root.
No, it's not root. It shouldn't be root. That should be avoided. So we should provide some guidance on, what we're expecting. And there's actually good guidance from Amazon on how to give the least credentials that are needed. But I would say that's the overall principle that you should play. If you're deploying to one task definition in ECS, you should provide credentials to GitLab for that project that are only able to do that one very specific thing.
So that's
There's a
interesting.
balance to strike there where you could end up with hundreds, thousands of credentials, depending on if you have many individual microservices. So there may be some efficiencies to gain in like at least grouping them in some way. But ultimately that's up to the user. In general, the principle is make them as specific as possible.
Oh yeah, so some of the complaints that I heard when I was in reInvent is that people were complaining that the GitLab user that they have to connect to AWS is like an almighty user that is allowed to do everything, and it's kind of scary for them. So
yeah, that is a scary thing. I don't know what's driving them to have to do that. So that would be interesting to look into. As far as I know, within CI/CD, we're not requiring them to do that, but maybe that's just the obvious, easy way to get it up and running, and then people stick with it, and then they later regret it. So there's that. The other thing that you can do is we have a Vault integration coming out in a release or two. Well, I guess the first thing that I'll say is that the credentials should be in environment variables rather than in a file that's checked in, because checking in the file, if you have a public repository, obviously people can then just look at the file and get the credentials. So that's a security risk to check them into a file. And in fact, I think we have scanning that will, on the SaaS side, or at least on the security team somewhere, we have scanning that will look for licenses and credentials and things like that in your repository and warn you if they're there so that you can pull them out and then invalidate them. So definitely in an environment variable. And then once the Vault integration comes out, I think the preferred beyond that is to use an environment variable that connects to Vault, where GitLab is only fetching a temporary credential that it can use for 15 minutes or whatever to do the deployment.
yeah, I'm just.
Yeah. So that's the workflow. And then you can see with these little iterations that we're getting closer and closer to the eventual idea of having kind of like that dream scenario that I was talking about at the beginning, where we just look at your project, we look at the credentials you gave us, and we know that we can deploy to AWS to start, but eventually the same thing for Azure, for GCP as well, for the non-Kubernetes but still cloud native deployment targets. So those are super, super commonly used.
Yeah, so the majority of the people are using EC2. So probably ECS or EC2 will be targeted first.
EC2 is the like virtual machine version, right? It's possible I'm misremembering all of the AWS
it's
acronyms.
a minimal instance.
But it's like a machine. It's more like VMware or something like that, where you're provisioning a box and you, it can be temporary, but it's not, you're not deploying a container, as far as I know.
I think you can deploy a container. It's a permanent URL that you get, so it's not like temporary.
Okay, it's something to double check. My understanding of EC2 is that it uses the AMIs, and they're just like virtual machine images that are something like VMware uses, that are more just like an image of a machine with memory, processor, and disk, and it's the more traditional way. And I wouldn't really call that way cloud native. It's possible I'm misremembering. I'm misremembering what EC2 is, but if it's that, then I would say it's out of scope for this project. More interesting is, and what you might be able to do with EC2 is run Docker on a virtual machine, and then, but that's sort of, you're getting into like a one step removed territory. If you're using ECS, which is the direct container deployment system, then that's much more automatable for us, and there's no AMIs involved. There's no.
So that's like the parallel to GKE, right? So the Kubernetes engine of Google.
Yeah, well, that's another orchestration layer.
So, totally different story. I'm just saying that's the parallel one.
I know. No, the EKS is the parallel to GKE.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, you're right.
Um, and I don't know what EC2 is in GCP, and I don't know what ECS is in GCP, but I'm sure that they offer virtual machines, and I'm sure that they offer just like direct container deployment. Something also interesting here that we haven't touched on yet is serverless. That's, I believe,
Well, that's
container.
even more complicated.
Yeah, in
Uh,
theory, it should just be another way of provisioning. It's something that we can explore later for sure, but
well, we can talk about that with collaboration with Victor on
yeah,
the serverless
for
team.
sure.
That's okay. But that is very specific to vendors. So
In
that's a
theory, it can be orchestrated in principle in the same way where like we look in your project, we find where it should be deployed to, and then automatically do it for you, even though it's not Kubernetes. And that's what I mean by it's kind of interesting in the same area.
Mm-hmm. So going back to the containers that we're deploying, we started with a container that allows you to do CLI commands directly from your pipelines. How much do we want to expand on the amount of containers that we're offering?
I think we should only make them if we need to. Um, AWS is kind of unique in not providing a deploy environment that's a standardized one, I believe. So there's an interesting sidetrack here, which is through this issue of providing a container, we sort of discovered the idea that in theory, we could support something that's kind of analogous to Circle CI orbs or GitHub Actions, at least the part of those that are about having a container that contains the environment that's needed to do a task and the code that's needed to then do it. And then have a standardized way to, from a GitLab CI YAML, call out to one of these containers, provide the configuration that's needed so that it can then run and do its thing. That's a perfect description of what we're doing with the AWS command line, where you could add, layers of automatic scripting. So deploying to ECS probably takes 2 or 3 AWS command line invocations to like log in, then like target the thing and then deploy to the thing. So doing this in a reusable way could let us implement other kinds of interesting containers that are self-contained in that way, that could really do anything. Like they could run a test suite, or they could literally do anything. So it would be a job that instead of having a script section would just have configuration to pass to a container, and the container would do whatever it wants. It would be an interesting way to potentially have like reusable, community contributed containers that can be integrated into GitLab CI. But that's sort of a tangent, and that interesting idea doesn't contribute per se to getting us to the hypercloud, to making hypercloud deployments easy, except in that we're kind of doing this for AWS, and that we want to do this in a container. So if it's not too much extra work, we can try and do it like the quote right way, or in an interesting way to start.
Okay. So scrolling through the issue that we have here, we have deploying to ECS, which we touched on, support type AWS environment variables, which we also discussed. I assume that will come out in 12.8. We also have here Terraform, for example, for supporting native cloud, which is kind of based on the fact that we don't only want to support Kubernetes. So like supplying a template that will give us a Terraform, Terraform supported GitLab CI YAML file could be a good way to start.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure how we would choose where to deploy it from, because if we're talking about native cloud, this is just extending additional methods, I would say, but it doesn't reach the cloud at the end of the day. Like, it gives me a Terraform CI, GitLab CI YAML file, but it doesn't tell me, okay, now you're deploying to Azure or to AWS, or, you know, so we're
Right.
missing a step there.
Yeah, there is a Terraform configuration file for sure
Mhm.
that describes the environment to be set up or modified, and then there is a target environment. But yeah, it's different because I think there's more flexibility in terms of what the target environment is. Terraform is able to abstract some of that away. What we would have to do is some research on how that's defined, what's possible, what could we auto detect there. I think recognizing that a project contains a Terraform deployment script should be like pretty straightforward, but figuring out automatically what it deploys to, that's going to depend on how Terraform works. And I'm not familiar enough with Terraform to know how complicated or easy that's going to be. It should be relatively easy, I would think, but somebody's going to have to be familiar with Terraform to know.
Okay. So going back to the issue, there's like a sub issue that's linked here, which is AWS product integrations. There's a long list here. I'm not sure how many go to CD and how many go to CI, but maybe it's worthwhile to review. So
let me open that up. It's a sub issue.
Yeah, it's a sub epic.
A sub epic, I see. Oh yeah, okay. Well, what this is this is actually an Alliance team issue that's tracking everything possible that they might want to connect with AWS and GitLab. So yeah, this is a bunch of stuff and isn't really, I wouldn't say that our team should, or you should be tracking this particular issue. I understand why they linked it because it's, I probably would have, if I was them, done it the other way. Like I wouldn't have made their Alliances issue a sub epic of something that we're delivering in a single release. I would have made this thing we're delivering in a single release like a sub item to their big picture view, but that's sort of neither here nor there. There are other issues being created out of this AWS product integrations epic that are the actual things to do, and those are being routed into whatever appropriate team delivers that sub thing. So this issue is more of just like a tracking thing for the Alliance team internally. Is the way
yeah, it seems like there's a lot of potential going into this after we actually support it, I guess, smoothly. We can then add monitoring to it and even scanning to make sure that you're not over budget and things like that. So there's a lot of interesting things that we can do here. Yeah. But I guess we need the building blocks first.
Yeah, we need the building blocks first, that's for sure. And that's running the deployment and trying to, as best we can, auto detect what's in the project and what we're deploying to on a per environment basis, just like we do for auto DevOps, and just make that super easy. That experience when you're a new user and you're like, okay, I'm gonna check out GitLab CI. I've heard good things about it. I'm using ECS. What is the experience? Is it like, whoa, it auto detected everything in my project and it was clear to me that I needed to just set up credentials and then it would deploy to my environment? Or is it spelunking for hours through the GitLab CI YAML specification and trying to figure out what's possible? It's more of the latter today. It's not clear what's possible or what's easy. If you take one of our, account experts who's worked with many customers to set up GitLab CI YAMLs in order to get deployed to AWS, they can probably get you up and running in 15 minutes. If you're a poor person trying to learn GitLab CI YAML at the same time and learn how GitLab works and try and get everything working, it's probably not clear where to start and what the output should look like. And so we're just sending people on these wild goose chases and they're not getting a good experience out of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But deploying with GitLab is easy and powerful and has amazing features. We just don't make it easy to get there if you don't have help.
Yeah, understood.
And so that's the overall concept of this. It's great that we're iterating. It's the way we work. We should do things in small iterations. We just need to not lose sight of that end goal of making it super easy.
Great. Anything that we need to add here?
Huh. I don't think so. I think that that's sort of the flavor we're going for.
Okay, I'm gonna stop
Yeah.
recording.
Okay.